opens beneath a cruel, cloudless sky where the heat seems to press down as heavily as the fear in Clara's chest, while she stands on the auction platform with her baby, Eli clutched tightly against her, his small fingers fisted in her dress, as if he can sense the danger around them. The town square buzzes with restless men, some curious, some cruel, their eyes lingering too long, their whispers slicing deeper than spoken insults. And Clara keeps her head lowered not from shame, but from exhaustion, because she has already lived through nights of hunger, loss, and the terrible moment she realized survival had turned her into something others believed they could own. And now, as the auctioneer's voice rings out, sharp and practiced, describing her age, her strength, and then the inconvenience of the child, laughter ripples through the crowd, a sound that makes Clara's arms tighten instinctively around Eli. Her mind racing with horrors, she tries not to imagine being separated from him, being sold to a man who sees her as nothing more than labor or worse, watching her baby passed off like excess baggage. Yet she forces herself to stay silent, knowing that pleading would only invite cruelty, and instead she focuses on the steady rise and fall of Eli's breath, drawing strength from his warmth as the bids begin, low and mocking at first, then sharper, each number stripping away another layer of hope. She tells herself to endure, to survive whatever comes, because mothers survive even when their hearts are breaking. But as the crowd's amusement grows, and the auctioneer prepares to move on, treating her fate as settled and grim, a sudden stillness spreads through the square, and Clara senses it before she sees it, the presence of someone who is not laughing, not judging, a quiet figure at the edge of the crowd whose gaze holds neither hunger nor cruelty, only a calm attention that makes her lift her eyes for the first time, and in that brief silent moment before any words are spoken, something shifts inside her, a fragile awareness that the worst may not be the only ending waiting for her and her child. Deepens the tension as the crowd grows restless, and the auction threatens to turn cruel, with Clara standing rigid on the platform while the bids stall and men scoff openly at the idea of paying for a woman burdened with a baby, their voices sharp with ridicule, as if her motherhood itself is a flaw. And the auctioneer attempts to salvage the moment by lowering expectations, his tone turning dismissive, which only tightens the fear coiled in Clara's chest, because she recognizes this shift as the most dangerous moment, when desperation invites the worst kinds of buyers. Yet, through the noise, she becomes acutely aware of the quiet man she noticed before, the one who has not joined the laughter, who has not called out a price, who stands apart with a stillness that feels deliberate, rather than timid, his long coat dusty, his hat pulled low, his posture relaxed but watchful, like a man accustomed to danger and unwilling to rush toward it. And Clara cannot stop herself from glancing at him again, searching his face for intent, finding instead an unreadable calm that unsettles her more than cruelty would, because it suggests choice. And then, just as the auctioneer begins to speak again, preparing to close the sale to a leering bidder near the front, the man finally steps forward, his boots sounding loud in the sudden hush. And when he speaks, his voice is neither loud nor dramatic, but firm enough to silence the sway, naming a price so fair and final, it stuns the crowd into stillness, provoking murmurs and sharp looks as men reassess him with unease, recognizing him now not as a bystander but as someone they would rather not challenge. And Clara's breath catches, because this is not rescue yet, not safety, but interruption. And interruption alone feels like mercy, as the auctioneer hesitates, measuring the man before him, sensing authority that doesn't need to be shouted, and with reluctant speed accepts the bid, sealing the moment with a strike of his gavel that echoes like a gunshot, while Clara stands frozen, unsure whether to tremble or hope, her heart pounding as the stranger meets her eyes for the first time, not as property but as a promise unspoken. And though he says nothing more, yet his presence alone shifts the balance of power, signaling that whatever comes next will not follow the path the crowd expected, leaving Clara suspended between fear and a fragile, dangerous possibility she barely dares to believe. Unfolds in the stunned silence that follows the final bid, the air thick with disbelief as the auctioneer's gavel settles and the crowd begins to murmur, men craning their necks to get a better look at the stranger who dared to disrupt the cruel rhythm of the sale. And Clara remains motionless on the platform, her body braced for orders, for hands, for being pulled forward like an object claimed. But instead the gunslinger steps closer with deliberate calm, stopping a respectful distance away, his eyes meeting hers steadily, as if to remind her she is still a person, still a mother. And when he finally speaks, his words are not addressed to the auctioneer or the crowd, but to Clara herself, quiet yet carrying far enough that everyone hears them, telling her she and the child will not be separated, that no one will harm them, and then delivering the words no one expected. "I'll be father and husband both." A sentence so startling it seems to knock the breath from the square, drawing gasps, laughter, and angry mutters in equal measure. Because such a claim in a place built on cruelty sounds like madness or mockery, yet his voice holds no trace of either, only a steady resolve that makes even the loudest men hesitate. And Clara feels her knees weaken, not from fear this time, but from shock, because no one has spoken of family, of protection, of belonging since the world collapsed around her. And though every instinct warns her not to trust too quickly, something in his stance, how he positions himself slightly between her and the crowd, how his hand rests loosely near his gun, not as a threat but a promise, tells her. These words were not said lightly, and as the auctioneer sputters and the men argue over what has just occurred, Clara looks down at Eli, who has begun to fuss, and then back at the gunslinger, realizing that whether this man is savior or stranger, the moment has already changed her fate. Because for the first time since she was captured, someone has claimed responsibility for her future without demanding her surrender, leaving her suspended between disbelief and a fragile hope that dares, against all reason, to take root, carries them away from the noise of the town and onto the long, uncertain road west, where the dust settles behind the horse and wagon like a closing chapter, and Clara rides in tense silence, every mile expecting the kindness she has been shown to unravel into ownership or control. Yet the gunslinger, who finally gives his name, as Jonah keeps his distance, speaking only when necessary, offering water when the sun grows harsh, and slowing the horse when Eli begins to cry, gestures so small they feel almost unreal to her. After all she has endured, and as the hours stretch on, she studies him quietly, noticing the way he scans the horizon out of habit, the old scars on his hands, the weariness beneath his calm, and she begins to understand that his silence is not emptiness but restraint. A man who has learned that words can wound as deeply as weapons. And one night by the fire, when Eli finally sleeps in her arms, Jonah explains in halting fragments that he has buried more than he has kept, that he knows what it means to lose a family and arrive too late to save them, and though he does not ask for sympathy or obedience, the truth in his voice settles something restless in Clara's heart, because he does not speak like a man collecting what he bought, but like one honoring a vow he chose. And still she remains cautious, reminding herself that survival has taught her to measure promises by time. Yet, as days pass and Jonah never crosses a boundary, never demands gratitude or submission, the fear that once ruled her thoughts begins to loosen its grip, replaced by a quiet, careful curiosity about the man riding ahead of her. And by the time the distant shape of his homestead rises from the horizon, Clara realizes that the journey itself has already changed her. Because for the first time in longer than she can remember, the road ahead feels uncertain, not with dread, but with possibility. Settles into the quiet rhythm of Jonah's homestead, where the land is rough and weathered but honest, and Clara steps down from the wagon, expecting rules to be laid out like fences, only to find doors left unlocked and space offered without condition. As Jonah shows her a small room of her own, sets down supplies within reach, and then pointedly steps back, making it clear through action rather than words, that she is not a possession to be managed. And in the days that follow, Clara moves through the cabin cautiously, half waiting for permission that never needs to be given, slowly realizing that no one is watching her for mistakes, that Jonah rises early to tend the land and returns at dusk, without questions or demands, speaking to Eli with an awkward gentleness that makes the child laugh, a sound Clara had feared she might never hear again. And as routines form shared meals, eaten in companionable silence, water thrown, laundry hung beneath an open sky, the tension that once lived permanently in her shoulders begins to ease, replaced by a fragile sense of normalcy. And though she still wakes some nights expecting to be dragged back into darkness, each morning she finds the same quiet safety waiting for her. And it is in these small, unremarkable moments that trust begins to grow, because Jonah never reminds her of the auction, never claims what he paid as leverage, instead telling her plainly that she may stay as long as she wishes, or leave when she is ready, a choice that overwhelms her more than captivity ever did. And as she watches Eli thrive in the open air, his laughter echoing across land that asks nothing of him but to grow, Clara begins to understand that this place is not just a refuge but a beginning, and that the greatest kindness Jonah offers is not protection alone, but dignity, allowing her to rediscover herself, not as something saved or owned, but as a woman slowly reclaiming her right to choose her own future. shatters the fragile peace when the past rides hard into the present, carried by a pair of men from the auction town who arrive uninvited. Their horses lathered and their expressions sharp with accusation, and Clara feels the old fear surge back instantly, her body remembering the platform, the laughter, the certainty that safety can be stolen without warning. But Jonah steps forward before she can retreat, placing himself between her and the newcomers with a calm that is far more frightening than anger, listening as they sneer about stolen property and unpaid debts, claiming the sale was unlawful and demanding Clara and the child be returned. And though his hand rests near his gun, Jonah does not reach for it, instead meeting their threats with quiet certainty, explaining that the auction was legal, the payment fair, and that neither woman nor child will be taken anywhere against their will, his voice steady enough to make the men hesitate, because they recognize in his stillness a man who has survived violence and does not need to prove it. And when one of them finally pushes too far, edging closer with a hand on his own weapon, Jonah's reputation reveals itself in a single controlled motion that stops just short of bloodshed, a warning rather than an attack, sending dust into the air and resolve into the moment. And the men retreat, muttering curses and promises they do not truly believe, leaving silence in their wake. And as the danger passes, Clara realizes her hands are shaking, not because Jonah used force, but because he did not need to, choosing restraint over dominance, protection without possession. And in that moment she understands that what he offered at the auction was not a performance or a bargain, but a line he would hold no matter the cost. And as she watches the men disappear down the trail, Clara knows something irreversible has happened, because the man standing beside her has defended her freedom as fiercely as her safety. And that knowledge binds her to him more deeply than any claim ever could. Unfolds in the quiet aftermath of danger, when the land seems to breathe again, and the weight of what almost happened settles slowly into understanding. And Clara finds herself unable to sleep, sitting by the dying embers while Eli rests nearby, replaying Jonah's words and actions until the truth becomes impossible to ignore, that he stood not because he owned her, but because he chose her. And when Jonah joins her, keeping his distance as always, she finally asks why he spoke those words at the auction, why he bound himself to strangers in front of men who would have mocked or challenged him, and he answers without drama, admitting that he once came home too late to save his own family, and has lived with the knowledge that silence can be as deadly as cruelty, that when he saw her clutching her child he recognized a moment where hesitation would destroy more than bodies. And as he speaks, Clara feels the last of her defenses soften, realizing she is no longer measuring escape routes or counting favors, but listening with an open heart. And when she tells him she is afraid, not of staying, but of hoping, Jonah does not rush to reassure her, simply telling her, hope is only dangerous when it is forced. And in that honesty she finds the courage to speak her own truth, that she is tired of surviving and wants to choose something for herself at last. And when she tells him she will stay not because she was bought or rescued, but because she wants a life built on respect and shared purpose, the words feel like reclaiming her name. And Jonah accepts her choice, with quiet gratitude rather than triumph, understanding that love cannot be claimed, only offered. And in that moment, the bond between them becomes real, not forged by circumstance or fear, but by two wounded people deliberately choosing to walk forward together, brings the story to rest in a season of quiet growth, where time softens old wounds, and the homestead fills with the ordinary miracles of daily life. And months after the auction that once defined her fate, Clara stands beneath a wide-open sky beside Jonah, no longer as a woman claimed by circumstance, but as one who has chosen her place in the world, with a small gathering of neighbors, bearing witness not to a transaction, but to a union built on trust. And as Eli toddles between them, laughing and unafraid, Clara feels the full weight of how far they have come, because the child who was once dismissed as a burden now carries Jonah's name and his steady presence, learning safety not as an exception but as a foundation. And Jonah, once shaped by loss and restraint, allows himself a future that does not depend on solitude, standing openly as husband and father not out of obligation but devotion. And when Clara reflects on the auction block, the fear and humiliation no longer burn with the same power, transformed instead into proof of survival and resilience. Because the past did not disappear, but it no longer owns her. And as the sun sets over land that has become a home through patience and choice rather than force, Clara understands that the words spoken in that hostile square were not a promise of rescue, but an invitation to rebuild, one she accepted on her own terms, and in that acceptance she finds peace, knowing that family, when chosen freely, is not a chain but a shelter, and that even in a world shaped by cruelty, mercy can still speak, quietly and decisively, and change everything.